In this video, we're going to test the generate user ID method inside of our utility class. And if I look up at the utility class and the generate user ID method, it calls the generate random string, and generate random string simply uses the alphabet and the random, and it does not really depend on any other objects that are outside of this class, and it does not access property files. So we do not really need an integration test for this case, but we will still keep it. Otherwise, we could remove the annotations from the top of the class. So let's test the generate user ID method. We will need to bring in the utility class, so I will auto-wire it into my utils test class, and I'll create a new class field, utils, and I'll call it utils as well, like this. Auto-wire it like this, and let me import auto-wired annotation. Now when I have it auto-wired into my utils test class, I can use it, and I will delete this commented outline, and I will use utils dot and then generate user ID. And generate user ID takes one argument, which is a length of generated user ID that we want to have. Let's have it equal to 30. So this method will generate user ID of 30 characters long. So I will create a new object, user ID equals to the generated user ID. And now I can use assertions to assert that user ID is not null and that user ID is exactly 30 characters long. So I will use assert not null and give it user ID. Let's import assert not null, and let's use assert true. And it takes a boolean value. We will take user ID, we know it's not null now, and we check its length, and we will check if it's equal to 30 characters exactly, like this. So if the method generate user ID is working fine, we should get a user ID which is not null and which is exactly 30 characters long. Let's run this unit test and see if it's working. Here we go, the bar is green, the test has passed, and we have one test which is ignored, and the generate user ID test is successful. We can also make sure that the two user IDs that are generated are not equal, because generate user ID must be a unique value. So what we can try, we can add user ID 2, for example, and then update our assertions and assert that user ID 2 is not null and that user ID 1 and user ID 2 are unique. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use user ID and then call equals ignore case and then get user ID 2 and add an exclamation mark here. So I'm asserting that user ID 1 and user ID 2 are not equal, which should result into true because the generate user ID must generate a unique user ID. So let me run it as unit test and see if it's passing. And here we go, the bar is green and the test is successful. So the generate user ID is working fine, we can test it and we can make sure that the user ID is exactly 30 characters long, and every time it is generated, it's unique. And if I change my assertions, for example, and test if it's 31 characters long, the test should fail. Here we go. The bar is green and the test is failing. So it's working. Let's change it back to 30 characters and let's continue.